This is BBIU, Biopharma Business Intelligence Unit. We provide structured insight and strategic analysis. In a world saturated with noise, surface narratives, and politically shaped data, BBIU operates at a different level of resolution. We focus on the forces beneath events: geopolitical and geoeconomic realignment, biopharma structural dynamics, liquidity stress and financial fragility, institutional drift and epistemic erosion, the architecture of power in global systems. Our work is guided by three principles: truth, structural coherence, and verifiable inference. Every model, every report, every forecast you see here is part of the analytical framework we use to brief decision makers worldwide. If you're looking for information, there are many places to go. If you're looking for structure, welcome. BBIUWP, Breaking the Civilian Maritime Siege. Feb 7th Structural Exposure of China's Gray Zone Naval Control through Conduct-Based Reclassification. Deferred escalation under civilian mass, where denial of force substitutes for denial of access. 2. Executive Summary. This paper examines China's use of mass civilian maritime platforms, formally registered as fishing vessels but operationally inactive as extractive units, as a structural mechanism for territorial denial and navigational interference. The system does not rely on overt military engagement. Instead, it projects force by exploiting the gap between civilian legal protection and coordinated state-directed conduct. Under the Orthogonal Differentiation Protocol, ODP, the internal structure revealed is one of mass without declared agency, a distributed civilian surface that absorbs enforcement friction while exerting physical and psychological control over maritime space. The force being projected is not kinetic, but inhibitory, preventing adversarial movement without crossing explicit thresholds of armed conflict. The constraint-absorbing stress is the legal political aversion of opposing naval forces, particularly those of the United States and Japan, to act against formally civilian vessels absent an explicit reclassification framework. This allows the system to appear stable: no shots fired, no declarations issued, no formal blockade announced. Structurally, however, the system degrades global maritime order by converting civilian protection into a strategic weapon. The longer the condition persists, the more enforcement paralysis accumulates, transferring systemic risk from the initiating actor to the international system itself. 3. Structural Diagnostics, ODP Core. Mass China's distant water fishing fleet constitutes extreme maritime mass: thousands of hulls, persistent presence, logistical depth, and rotational endurance. This mass is historically accumulated and institutionally subsidized, embedding inertia that resists rapid displacement. Charge: the fleet's charge is directionally aligned toward denial, not extraction. When vessels are present in dense formations without fishing activity, the narrative polarity shifts from economic use to spatial control. The charge pulls enforcement actors into hesitation rather than confrontation. Vibration: the system exhibits low-frequency but high-amplitude vibration. Individual vessels are inert. The formation is destabilizing. Small perturbations, warnings, patrols resonate weakly, while large-scale responses risk narrative rupture. Inclination: external pressure gradients arise from competing naval forces attempting transit, presence, or reinforcement. The civilian mass sits at the inflection point of this gradient, absorbing inclination without responding kinetically. Time is the dominant stabilizer. Persistence favors the system because enforcement actors operate on decision cycles slower than the fleet's ability to remain on station. Delay converts ambiguity into de facto control. 4. Structural Indices, ODP Index, 0.81. The internal structure is highly exposed. Civilian status is doing disproportionate strategic work relative to its original legal function. CDV, Composite Displacement Velocity, 0.67. Exposure is increasing rapidly as fleet scale and coordination outpace existing legal interpretations. DFP Index, 0.84. China's ability to project force outward without overt military engagement is high, achieved through distributed civilian mass rather than concentrated naval power. Number 5. Phase Diagnosis Active Force Projector, Gray Zone Mode. The system has moved beyond reactive consolidation. It is actively projecting spatial denial while remaining below formal conflict thresholds. The trajectory indicates increasing saturation. As the fleet's mass grows, the legal fiction sustaining its civilian protection becomes more brittle. 6. BBIU Structural Judgment. China is not attempting to win naval engagements, it is attempting to remove the engagement decision entirely. The adjustment being deferred is the explicit recognition that mass civilian interference constitutes state-level maritime force. Current responses fail because they address illegality episodically rather than structurally, allowing the same mechanism to reconstitute elsewhere. 7. BBIU opinion. The strategic innovation here is not the fleet itself, but the conversion of civilian immunity into a denial system. This creates an epistemic risk. If left unaddressed, civilian classification ceases to be a protective category and becomes a coercive one. Comparatively, no other major power has scaled civilian maritime mass to this degree for persistent spatial control. The implication is not immediate war, but systemic erosion. Freedom of navigation becomes conditional on tolerance of gray zone occupation. The critical insight is that escalation is not triggered by action, but by reclassification. Once conduct, not registry, becomes the organizing principle, the system's apparent stability collapses. 8. Forward structural scenarios. Scenario 1. Continuation under current balance. Civilian fleets expand geographically. Enforcement hesitation persists. Maritime order fragments regionally. Scenario 2. Forced adjustment. Conduct-based reclassification removes civilian operational protection. The fleet loses its inhibitory function without immediate kinetic exchange. Scenario 3. External shock interaction. A crisis, e.g. Taiwan contingency, forces rapid decision-making. Without prior structural adjustment, escalation becomes binary and uncontrolled. 9. Why this matters. Institutions, civilian protection regimes risk strategic capture. Policymakers delay compounds enforcement paralysis. Long horizon capital. Maritime instability embeds risk into global supply chains. Strategic actors. Gray zone dominance shifts from innovation to liability once exposed. Relevance here is structural, not prescriptive. 10. References. UNCLOS primary texts. IMO navigational safety frameworks. Open source analyses of maritime militia and distant water fishing fleets. Satellite-based maritime pattern studies. Annex 1. Activation pathway and time compression conduct-based reclassification to neutralize gray zone maritime blockades. Purpose of the Annex. This Annex outlines the minimum institutional steps required to operationalize the conduct-based reclassification framework described in the paper, and the time compression window under which it can be made effective before or at the onset of a crisis. This is not a tactical sequence. It is a governance and decision architecture. Phase 1. Pre-crisis enablement, structural priming. Timeframe, T90 to T30 days, can be compressed if pre-drafted. Step 1. Internal legal convergence actors, executive branches, defense legal offices, foreign ministries, U.S., Japan, core allies. Internal alignment on the principle that civilian protection is conditional on conduct, not registry. Agreement on a non-kinetic definition of loss of civilian operational protection. Explicit separation between reclassification and use of force. Why this matters. This removes internal vetoes during crisis onset. Estimated time, 30 to 60 days if started from scratch, 7 days if language is pre-drafted. Step 2. Conduct criteria finalization. Actors, legal maritime safety authorities. Finalization of objective auditable criteria, e.g., mass presence without extractive activity, persistent coordinated maneuvering, interference with navigation or military movement, AIS suppression or manipulation. Why this matters. It anchors the framework in observable behavior, not intent. Estimated time, 2 to 3 weeks, can be reduced to days if criteria are pre-agreed. Step 3. Evidence architecture readiness. Actors, ISR, maritime authorities, public affairs. Agreement on what evidence is sufficient to support reclassification. Satellite SAR patterns, behavioral persistence, absence of phishing indicators. Prearranged public disclosure format, maps, time series, summaries. Why this matters. Prevents post hoc disputes over proof. Estimated time, 2 weeks, often already available. Phase 2, declaratory activation, threshold crossing. Timeframe, T72H to T24H. Step 4, coordinated public declaration actors. Executive leadership, U.S., Japan, optionally others. Issuance of a joint or parallel declaration stating that vessels meeting defined conduct criteria no longer qualify for civilian operational protection and will be treated as irregular state maritime platforms. Key characteristics: ex ante, before force, conduct-based, non-punitive in language. Why this matters. This is the legal pivot that collapses gray zone ambiguity. Estimated time 24 to 48 hours once pre-drafted. Step 5 Maritime Safety and Navigation Notices. Actors, maritime authorities, coast guards, navies. Issuance of formal notices, declaring interference zones, ordering clearance of routes, warning of enforcement to restore navigation safety. Why this matters: creates the warning persistence record required for legitimacy. Estimated time, same-day issuance, Phase 3, functional neutralization without escalation. Timeframe, T24H to T72H. Step 6, status transition by persistence trigger. Vessels persist in blocking or interfering after notice. Effect, they transition from irregular platforms, active navigational threat. This is a status shift, not a punishment. Estimated time, immediate upon documented persistence. Step 7, defensive enforcement enablement actors, military and Coast Guard forces. Authorization to enforce clearance, escort protected transit, restore freedom of navigation within proportional and defensive bounds. Why this matters: this is where action becomes legally defensible without being escalatory by default. Estimated time, immediate once Step 6 is met. Phase 4, systemic lock-in, global applicability, timeframe T+7 to T+30 days. Step 8, port, insurance, and market synchronization. Actors, transport ministries, insurers, port authorities. Alignment to deny services to vessels classified under the framework. Extension of reclassification effects beyond the immediate theater. Why this matters: prevents the model from reconstituting elsewhere. Estimated time, 1 to 4 weeks depending on coalition size. Annex 2. Direct economic impact of restricted access to international waters. Structural economic consequences for China's distant water fishing system. Purpose of the annex. This annex isolates the direct economic effects on China, resulting from the inability to operate large-scale fishing fleets in international waters and foreign EEZs under the conduct-based reclassification framework. The analysis focuses on systemic economic stress, not enforcement mechanics. 1. Structural role of distant water fishing in China. China's distant water fishing (DWF) fleet is not a marginal sector. It functions as a protein acquisition system supplementing domestic food supply, a foreign currency and trade stabilizer, a labor absorption mechanism for coastal regions, and a logistical extension of China's maritime presence. Crucially, profitability is structurally dependent on access to international waters and foreign EEZs, not domestic seas. 2. Immediate revenue loss mechanism. Conduct-based reclassification does not need to seize vessels to impose cost. Restriction of access produces instantaneous economic effects: idle hulls without compensating domestic fishing grounds, collapse of catch volume from high-yield distant stocks, loss of export-grade seafood supply chains. Structural effect. Revenue loss scales linearly with fleet size and immediately with time at sea denied. This is a flow shock, not a stock shock. Losses accumulate daily and cannot be deferred. 3. Subsidy stress and fiscal load transfer. China's DWF fleet operates with fuel subsidies, port support, maintenance and insurance backing, local government employment guarantees. When fleets are prevented from operating, subsidies stop being productivity enhancing and become pure fiscal drag. Central and provincial governments must choose between increasing subsidies to idle fleets or absorbing unemployment and regional instability. ODP implication: the economic mass of the fleet converts from externalized presence to internal fiscal burden. 4. Protein supply and price volatility. Distant water fishing contributes materially to domestic seafood consumption, price stabilization of protein substitutes, food security optics for coastal and urban populations. Restricted access triggers reduced supply, upward price pressure, substitution stress on meat imports and aquaculture. Structural risk: food price sensitivity amplifies political and social cost disproportionately relative to the sector's nominal GDP share. 5. Export and trade disruption. China's seafood exports rely on continuous volume throughput, compliance signaling to importing markets, cold chain logistics synchronized with port access. Reclassification-linked port denials and compliance scrutiny delay shipments, increase rejection rates, raise transaction costs. DFP impact. China's ability to convert maritime presence into trade leverage degrades, especially in EU and premium markets. 6. Employment and regional stability effects. The DWF system absorbs labor across vessel crews, processing hubs, logistics, and maintenance yards. When fleets are idle, employment losses concentrate regionally, retraining pathways are limited, social support costs rise. This creates localized stress pockets that require central mitigation. 7. Long horizon capital effects. Sustained restriction alters investment logic. Fleet renewal becomes unattractive, shipyard demand softens, insurers and financiers price in chronic access risk. Structural outcome. Capital allocation shifts away from expansion toward maintenance and survival. 8. Net economic effect, BBIU synthesis. The economic consequence of restricting access to international waters is not catastrophic collapse, but persistent structural erosion. Daily revenue loss, rising fiscal subsidy burden, food supply volatility, export friction, labor absorption failure. Importantly, these costs are internalized by China, whereas the strategic benefit of the fleet was previously externalized. 9. Strategic implication. The conduct-based reclassification framework transforms China's distant water fishing fleet from a low-cost, externally leveraged coercive asset into a high-cost, internally destabilizing economic liability. This shift occurs without kinetic engagement and scales globally. BBIU economic judgment. China's maritime gray zone strategy remains viable only while the fleet can operate, extract, and monetize. Denial of access to international waters converts scale into vulnerability. The economic pressure is cumulative, silent, and politically difficult to offset, especially when combined with food security and employment sensitivity. The economic pressure is cumulative, silent, and politically difficult to offset, especially when combined with food security and employment sensitivity. End of document. If your organization requires structural clarity, BBIU is available for private briefings and strategic analysis. To initiate contact, visit biopharmabusinessintelligenceunit.com and reach out through the institutional access channel.